My mother-in-law banned me from cooking in her kitchen, so I bought the house. For 11 years, I wasn't allowed to touch the stove in my mother-in-law's kitchen. Not the good stove, the 8-burner range she'd had custom installed the year her husband's business finally turned a profit, the one she referred to, without irony, as the heart of this family. I'm a professional pastry chef. I've run my own bakery for 6 years. I've cooked in commercial kitchens that turn out 400 covers on a Saturday night, and in my mother-in-law's kitchen, I was allowed to chop vegetables at the small prep table in the corner, as far from her range as the room's dimensions would physically allow. "This is my kitchen, Megan," she told me the very first Thanksgiving I offered to help, in a tone as pleasant and immovable as a closed door. "You're welcome to keep me company." I kept her company for 11 years. Then her husband's investments collapsed, the house went up for a distressed sale nobody in the family could stop, and 6 weeks later, my husband and I closed on it through a private LLC neither of us put our names on publicly. The first thing I did after we got the keys was stand at that 8-burner range, alone, and turn on every single burner at once, just to hear them all catch flame together. Welcome back to Family Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever been made to feel like a guest in a room you deserve to belong in, this story is for you. Stay with me to the end, because what I served at the first dinner I hosted in that kitchen is not what any of you are expecting. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But before I tell you about the sale, and the LLC, and the 8 burners catching flame all at once, I need to tell you who I was the year I married into this family, because I walked into that kitchen the first time genuinely excited, with absolutely no idea what the next 11 years were going to cost me. My name is Megan. I'm 33 years old, and I own a small bakery outside Asheville called Larkspur, which specializes in laminated pastry, croissants, kuehnemen, the kind of thing that takes 3 days of folding and resting dough before it ever sees an oven. I trained formally, 2 years at a culinary program in Charleston followed by 4 years working under a chef named Antoine at a French bakery in Atlanta before I ever had the nerve to open my own place. Food, for me, has never been a hobby. It's closer to a language, the way I understand and process almost everything in my life, and I think that's part of why what happened in my mother-in-law's kitchen cut as deep as it did for as long as it did. It wasn't just about being excluded from cooking. It was about being told, over and over, in the one language I actually speak fluently, that I didn't belong in the conversation. Food, for me, has never been a hobby. It's closer to a language, the way I understand and process almost everything in my life, and I think that's part of why what happened in my mother-in-law's kitchen cut as deep as it did for as long as it did. It wasn't just about being excluded from cooking. It was about being told, over and over, in the one language I actually speak fluently, that I didn't belong in the conversation. I want to tell you a little about how Larkspur grew over those same 11 years, because I think the contrast matters. I opened with a single lease storefront and 2 part-time employees, working most mornings alone before dawn, and by the time the house sale happened, we'd expanded twice, added a wholesale accounts division supplying pastries to a dozen restaurants across 2 counties, and I'd hired a full-time head baker so I could finally take an occasional weekend off for the first time in years. None of that growth ever seemed to register with Patricia the way it might have with someone who'd asked even a single question about the actual mechanics of running a small business. I don't say this bitterly, exactly, just factually. I built something real and lasting during the same 11 years I spent at that corner table, and the 2 facts existed, for Patricia, in almost entirely separate universes that never once intersected in her mind. I met my husband, Ryan, at a farmer's market, of all places, on a Saturday morning when I was selling day-old pastries out of a folding table before Larkspur even had a storefront. He bought a kuehnemen, came back the next Saturday and bought 2, and by the 3rd Saturday he'd worked up the nerve to ask if I wanted to get coffee sometime that wasn't at 7 in the morning while I was still covered in flour. Ryan's an accountant, methodical in the specific way accountants often are, the kind of person who reads terms and conditions in full and remembers exactly which drawer the spare batteries live in. I want to tell you about our early dating years a little, because I think it matters for understanding why I trusted this family as much as I initially did. Ryan came from a household that, from the outside, looked genuinely enviable: successful father, accomplished mother, a warm, well-appointed home that hosted the kind of holiday gatherings people in the neighborhood apparently talked about for weeks afterward. I'd grown up more modestly, my mother a school nurse, my father a union electrician, our own holiday dinners loud and a little chaotic in a rented duplex with mismatched chairs pulled in from 3 different rooms. Meeting Ryan's family felt, in an odd way, like getting a glimpse of a life I hadn't known I wanted, and I think that made me slower than I should have been to notice the specific cost buried inside that polish. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and I said yes standing in my own bakery kitchen at closing time, flowers still on my hands, which felt, in retrospect, like the appropriate setting for how the rest of our life together was going to go. Ryan's mother, Patricia, was warm to me in the specific way some people are warm right up until you become a permanent fixture rather than a temporary guest. At our engagement dinner, she toasted to welcoming a talented young woman into the family, and I remember feeling, genuinely, like I'd landed somewhere good. Patricia had built a formidable reputation among her own social circle as a hostess, decades of holiday dinners, garden parties, the kind of woman whose Christmas Eve dinner got mentioned in the neighborhood newsletter one year, an honor she brought up periodically for the following several holiday seasons. Her husband, Ryan's father Walter, had spent 30 years building a regional commercial real estate firm, and the family home reflected it, a large colonial on 2 acres, with a kitchen that had been renovated twice, most recently the year before I met Ryan, into something that genuinely belonged in a design magazine. 8-burner range, 2 ovens, a walk-in pantry, marble counters. Patricia had selected herself after, according to family legend, rejecting 11 other samples. I want to tell you about that kitchen a little more, because it genuinely was remarkable, and I think it matters that I acknowledge that clearly rather than painting it only as a symbol of exclusion. The range had come from a specialty importer, custom ordered, the kind of appliance most home cooks only ever see in professional photo shoots. The pantry was organized with a precision that would have impressed any commercial kitchen manager: labeled bins, a rotation system for dry goods, a dedicated shelf just for holiday-specific serving pieces used exactly twice a year. Patricia had genuinely built something extraordinary in that room, through decades of attention and care, and I think that's part of why the exclusion stung as much as it did. It wasn't a mediocre kitchen I was being kept out of. It was a genuinely exceptional one, built by someone with real skill of her own, someone who simply couldn't imagine sharing that particular skill with anyone else, least of all a daughter-in-law who might, in some private calculation I never got to see, turn out to be better at it than she was. I found out exactly what that kitchen meant to her at my very first Thanksgiving with the family, 4 months into dating Ryan, before we were even engaged. I'd offered, the week before, to bring a dessert, something small, a tart tatin I'd been perfecting for months. Patricia had said, on the phone, in a voice that sounded genuinely pleased, "Oh, how lovely, we'd love that." I arrived that Thanksgiving morning with the tart carefully wrapped, along with an offer to help finish the sides in the kitchen, the way I'd have offered at literally any other home I'd ever been a guest in. Patricia took the tart, set it on a side counter without unwrapping it, and said, "This is my kitchen, Megan. You're welcome to keep me company," gesturing toward a small prep table wedged into the corner near the walk-in pantry, roughly as far from the 8-burner range as the room's layout allowed. I laughed, at first, assuming it was some kind of joke, a bit, the way people sometimes protect their space with humor. It wasn't a joke. I spent that entire Thanksgiving afternoon sitting at that small corner table, chopping celery and pearl onions that never actually made it into any dish I could identify at dinner, while Patricia moved through her kitchen with the fluid, practiced confidence of a woman who had cooked this exact meal, in this exact configuration, for over 30 years, and had no intention of sharing an inch of that choreography with anyone, least of all the professionally trained pastry chef her son happened to be dating. I want to tell you about the specific texture of that afternoon, because I think it matters more than the single incident of the tart. I watched, from that corner table, as Patricia orchestrated an entire multi-course Thanksgiving meal with genuine, considerable skill, and some part of me, even that very first year, recognized real talent in what she was doing, timing a turkey and 3 side dishes and 2 pies to all land on the table within minutes of each other, the kind of choreography that takes decades to internalize. I remember thinking, even then, that under different circumstances, I might have loved learning from her, might have wanted exactly the kind of mentorship a new daughter-in-law sometimes gets from a mother-in-law who cooks. That version of the relationship never got a chance to exist, not because I didn't want it, but because Patricia's kitchen had room for exactly one skilled cook, and she had already decided, before I ever unwrapped a single dish, that the position was permanently filled. My tart tatin, I noticed, never made it to the dessert table that day. I found it later, in the walk-in pantry, still wrapped, tucked behind a case of sparkling cider. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was an oversight, a busy kitchen, easy to lose track of one dish among many. I want to be honest with you about something, the same thing I've had to be honest with myself about for years now. I am, by nature, a person who gives people a very long runway before I believe they mean what their actions are telling me. That runway, in Patricia's case, turned out to be 11 years long. I want to tell you about the shape those 11 years actually took, because I think the specifics matter more than the general feeling of exclusion. It wasn't one dramatic incident. It was a policy, applied consistently, dressed up in different justifications depending on the occasion. At Christmas the following year, our first as an engaged couple, I offered again, and Patricia told me the oven runs differently than most people expect, and she didn't want anyone unfamiliar with it getting flustered during a big meal. I have run commercial kitchens with 6 ovens firing simultaneously during a holiday rush. I said nothing. I sat at the corner table. The year Ryan and I got married, I offered to make the wedding cake myself, professionally, at cost, the way I've done for a dozen friends over the years. Patricia told me, gently, that she'd already spoken to a wonderful bakery downtown, a bakery, I later learned, she'd found through a coworker's recommendation, having never once asked me a single question about what I actually specialized in. I baked our wedding cake in secret, at my own bakery, at 2 a.m. 3 days before the wedding, a small groom's cake that Ryan requested privately, and I never told Patricia I'd made it. I still don't know if she ever found out. I want to tell you about that night, actually, baking in the dark, alone, 3 days before my own wedding, because it's a memory I've returned to more than almost any other over the years. Ryan came by around midnight with coffee, sat on a flour sack in the corner of my kitchen watching me pipe borders onto a cake his own mother had decided, without consulting either of us, that I wasn't qualified to make for our wedding. He didn't say much that night. But at one point he said, quietly, I don't know how to fix this with her. I don't even fully understand what this is yet. I told him he didn't need to fix anything that night, that I just needed him there, on the flour sack, keeping me company the way I'd spent years keeping his mother company at her own corner table. He stayed until 4 a.m. That cake, the secret one, the groom's cake nobody but Ryan and I ever knew I'd actually made myself, sat on a side table at our reception the whole night, and every time I looked at it, I felt something complicated, pride in the work, and a low, persistent ache that I'd had to make it in secret at all. There was a particular year, our third Thanksgiving as a married couple, that I think about more than any other, because it's the one where I finally understood this wasn't going to change no matter how much time passed. I'd brought, unannounced, a pie, not asking permission this time, just quietly setting it on the dessert table myself before Patricia could redirect it to the pantry. She noticed within minutes. She didn't say anything to me directly. Instead, I overheard her, in the kitchen, telling my sister-in-law Beth, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "I do wish people would ask before adding things to my dessert table. It throws off the whole presentation." I stood in the doorway holding a stack of napkins, and Beth caught my eye, and I watched her decide, in real time, not to say anything either, and I understood, in that moment, that this wasn't just about Patricia. It was about an entire family that had learned, over decades, that contradicting her cost more than it was worth, and I'd simply become the newest person absorbing that particular tax. I want to tell you about a conversation with Beth later that same evening, because it revealed something important about how long this pattern had actually been running in the family, well before I ever arrived. We were washing dishes together, away from the main room, and I mentioned, carefully, that I'd overheard the comment about the dessert table. Beth sighed and said, "She did the same thing to me, you know. Before you. Years ago, when I first started dating your brother-in-law. I brought a casserole to Easter once, and it disappeared into the fridge and never made it to the table. I stopped bringing anything eventually. It was just easier." I stood there with a dish towel in my hands, absorbing the fact that I wasn't even the first daughter-in-law this had happened to, that Patricia had apparently run this exact playbook at least once before I ever walked into that kitchen, and that Beth, like me, had simply adapted rather than confronted it, the family's unspoken solution passed down like a recipe nobody wrote down but everyone somehow learned to follow. I want to tell you about my mother, because I think the contrast matters. My own mother taught me to cook, standing on a step stool at her elbow starting around age 6, and her kitchen operated on a completely different philosophy: more hands, more mess, more voices arguing pleasantly about whether the roux needed another 5 minutes. I grew up believing a kitchen at its best was a shared, slightly chaotic thing, built by everyone who cared enough to show up in it. Patricia's kitchen operated on the opposite philosophy entirely, a kitchen as a stage with exactly one performer, and everyone else relegated to audience, and I think part of why it took me so long to name what was happening is that I kept unconsciously waiting for her kitchen to eventually resemble the one I'd grown up in, waiting for an invitation that the entire structure of her hosting made clear was never coming. Ryan, I should say, was not blind to any of this, though I want to be fair to him about the specific shape of his blindness. He noticed the corner table. He noticed the tart tatin in the pantry, actually, that very first Thanksgiving, and he brought it up to his mother gently, and she waved it off as a simple mistake, too much going on in the kitchen to keep track of every dish. He believed her, that first time, and I understood why. You want to believe your mother when she gives you an easy explanation, especially when the alternative explanation is that she's systematically excluding the person you love from something she clearly cares about deeply. It took years, and repetitions, and finally a comment from his own sister, for Ryan to fully see the pattern the way I'd been seeing it since year one. I met my best friend, Dana, at a pastry competition 6 years ago, and she became, over time, the person I processed all of this with, the way I imagine most of you watching have someone in your own life who hears the version of the story you don't tell everyone else. Dana ran her own catering company and had, in her words, seen every flavor of controlling hostess the South has to offer, and she never once told me I was overreacting, which I appreciated, because plenty of other people in my life, over the years, gently suggested I might be reading too much into just how some mothers-in-law are. Dana's response, every single time I told her about a new Patricia incident, was some version of, "Megan, you could plate a 5-course tasting menu blindfolded. The woman is threatened by you, and she's dressing that threat up as tradition." I want to tell you about a specific conversation with Dana, from around year 5, because it's the one that first planted the seed of an idea I wouldn't act on for years afterward. We were closing up my bakery kitchen late one night, and I was venting about a recent Thanksgiving incident, and Dana, only half joking, said, "You know, someday that woman's kitchen is going to need someone else to take care of it. Big houses like that don't run themselves forever. When that day comes, I hope you're standing right there." I laughed it off at the time, told her that was a strange and slightly dark thing to hope for, and she shrugged and said she wasn't hoping for anything bad to happen to Patricia specifically, she was just observing that control has a shelf life, and people who build their whole identity around being irreplaceable in one room eventually meet a moment where the room changes without their permission. I didn't think about that conversation again for years. I thought about it constantly during the 6 weeks I'm going to tell you about next time. I didn't fully believe Dana for a long time. I think some part of me needed to believe Patricia's exclusion was really about the kitchen, about tradition, about 30 years of muscle memory she wasn't ready to share, because that explanation was so much easier to live with than the alternative, that it was about me specifically, about what I represented, a professionally trained chef marrying into a family whose matriarch had built a significant piece of her identity around being the only skilled cook anyone in that family had ever needed. There's a particular year I want to tell you about, our 6th Thanksgiving, because it's the one where the pattern finally sharpened into something I could no longer explain away as tradition or busyness. My father-in-law Walter had been diagnosed with early-stage heart trouble that spring, and his doctor had given the family a fairly specific list of dietary adjustments: lower sodium, less saturated fat, particular attention to how food was prepared rather than just what was served. I offered, that year, to handle the entire Thanksgiving meal myself, specifically because I actually had the professional training to adjust a full holiday spread to those requirements without sacrificing flavor, something I do professionally, regularly, for clients with dietary restrictions. Patricia told me, in front of the whole family this time, not privately, that she wasn't going to let Walter's diagnosis turn Thanksgiving into a science project, and that she'd manage his portions herself. Walter, sitting right there, said nothing. I watched a man being actively managed around his own health condition by a wife who'd rather maintain kitchen control than accept help from someone qualified to actually help, and something in me went cold in a way it hadn't during any of the smaller slights over the years. I want to tell you about the meal itself that year, because I noticed things at the table I hadn't let myself notice as clearly before. Walter ate the gravy, heavy and clearly made with a full stick of butter the way Patricia had always made it, and I watched him eat it anyway, quietly, without comment, the same deference he'd apparently practiced for decades on smaller matters now extending, alarmingly, to his own cardiac health. I caught his eye once across the table, and something passed between us, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were both sitting in the same particular kind of cage, just different rooms of it. I didn't say anything at the table. But I remember going home that night and telling Ryan, more directly than I ever had before, that I thought his mother's need for control had stopped being merely irritating and had become something closer to actively dangerous, and I needed him to understand the difference. I brought this up with Ryan that night, in the car, and for the first time, I saw real anger on his face directed at his mother rather than gentle deflection on her behalf. He didn't say much. But I noticed, over the following months, that he started asking his father directly about his health, cutting Patricia out of that particular loop when he could, a small crack that I don't think either of us named out loud at the time but that I think mattered more than we realized. I want to tell you about Walter, actually, because he matters a great deal to how this story ends. Walter was quiet in the way some men become quiet after decades of marriage to someone louder and more decisive than they are, not unhappy exactly, just settled into a role of gentle deference that had calcified over 30-some years. But Walter noticed things. He noticed, I came to learn much later, far more than he ever said out loud at the time. He noticed the corner table. He noticed the tart tatin in the pantry, that very first year, actually, independently of Ryan. He told me, years later, that he'd seen it there and almost said something and decided, in the moment, that it wasn't his fight to have with his wife of 3 decades over a dessert. He carried a quiet, low-grade guilt about that decision, it turned out, for far longer than I ever knew. I want to tell you about one more small moment with Walter, from around year 7, because it stayed with me. He found me alone on the back porch during a family gathering, the two of us escaping the noise of the house for a few minutes, and he said, out of nowhere, you know, I built that firm from a card table in a spare bedroom. Patricia used to bring me sandwiches while I worked, back before we had 2 dimes to combine. I think somewhere along the way, once we had the money for the house she always wanted, she needed the kitchen to be the one place where she was still building something with her own hands, the way I got to keep building the firm with mine. I don't think she knows how to let anyone share that with her without it feeling like losing it. I didn't know what to do with that explanation at the time. It didn't make the corner table feel less small, but it added a layer of context I hadn't had before, a small window into a woman I'd spent years experiencing only as an obstacle. I want to tell you about the years between that 6th Thanksgiving and the year everything changed, because there were several more incidents worth mentioning, even if none of them individually would sound as dramatic as a lawsuit or a public confrontation. There was the year I offered to teach my niece, Beth's daughter, a few basic pastry techniques during a family visit, and Patricia insisted on supervising the lesson herself, in her own kitchen, correcting my instructions in front of the 8-year-old in ways that were, professionally speaking, simply incorrect, telling her to overwork pie dough in a way that guarantees a tough crust, a mistake I've spent my whole career training people out of. I didn't argue with her in front of my niece. I corrected the dough quietly, later, when Patricia stepped out of the room, and I remember feeling a very specific, very small grief about that moment, watching a child I loved get slightly worse instruction than she deserved because the adult giving it valued being right over being accurate. I want to tell you about my niece a bit more, actually, because she matters to this story in a way I didn't expect at the time. Her name is Ivy, and she's sharp in a quiet, observant way that reminds me of myself at that age. A few weeks after that lesson, she called me, on her mother's phone, just to ask a follow-up question about the dough, and near the end of the call, she said, unprompted, in the specific blunt way children sometimes say the truest things in a room, "Grandma doesn't really let you cook, does she?" I didn't know how to answer a question like that from an 8-year-old. I told her that everybody has their own kitchen rules, and left it there, but I hung up that call feeling strangely exposed, understanding that even the youngest person in this family had noticed the pattern I'd spent years telling myself might just be in my head. There was another year, my bakery's 4th anniversary, when Larkspur got written up in a regional food magazine, a genuinely significant piece of press for a business my size. I mentioned it at a family dinner, not boastfully, just as an update on how things were going, and Patricia's only response was, "That's nice, dear. Did I tell you about the new caterer I found for the garden club luncheon? Absolutely wonderful with pastry." I sat there, at her table, having just been told about a professional caterer's pastry skills by a woman who'd spent 9 years keeping me at a corner table specifically to avoid acknowledging my own. I started seeing a therapist, actually, around year 8. Not exclusively because of Patricia, life had its own accumulated weight by then, but the kitchen situation came up often enough in our sessions that my therapist, a woman named Dr. Reyes, eventually said something that reframed the whole situation for me. She said, "Megan, I want you to notice that you keep describing this as being about cooking. I don't think it's about cooking at all. I think Patricia has built her entire sense of value around being irreplaceable in one specific role, and your existence, your actual skill, threatens that irreplaceability every time you walk into her kitchen. This was never going to be solvable by you cooking better or worse. It was only ever going to be solvable by her feeling secure enough not to need the exclusion." I sat with that for a long time. It didn't make the corner table feel any less small. But it helped me understand, finally, that nothing I could have done differently in that kitchen, over 11 years, would have changed the outcome, because the problem had never actually been about the food. I want to tell you about another session with Dr. Reyes, closer to year 9, because it's the one where I finally started to let go of some guilt I'd been carrying without fully realizing it. I told her I sometimes felt like I should have pushed harder, said something directly to Patricia years earlier, forced the issue instead of quietly absorbing 11 Thanksgivings at a corner table. Dr. Reyes asked me what I thought would have actually happened if I had. I sat with that question for a while, and eventually admitted that I honestly didn't think it would have changed anything, that Patricia's need for control in that specific room seemed, from everything I'd observed over the years, close to structural, load-bearing for her entire sense of self, not something a single honest conversation was likely to dismantle. Dr. Reyes nodded and said, "Then I want you to release some of the guilt about not fighting harder. Sometimes the wisest response to an immovable object isn't more force. It's patience, and clarity, and waiting for circumstances to shift in a direction you can't force on your own." I didn't know, sitting in her office that afternoon, how literally that advice was about to come true. Walter's health declined further in year 9, a second cardiac event that landed him in the hospital for 11 days. During that stretch, with the family scattered between hospital visits and work, I quietly took over meal coordination for the extended family without asking Patricia's permission, cooking simple, medically appropriate meals and dropping them off at their house, leaving them in the refrigerator with reheating instructions taped to the container. Patricia never mentioned these meals to me directly. But Walter did, months later, privately, catching me alone in the hallway during a family gathering. He said, quietly, "Those meals you left, during the hospital stretch. I want you to know I noticed. I ate every one of them, and they were the best food I'd had in years, and I never told Patricia who made them, because I didn't think she was ready to hear it. I didn't know what to say to that. I still think about it often. I want to tell you about the 11 days of that hospital stretch a little more, because they mattered to how I understood the whole family afterward. I drove to the hospital most evenings after closing the bakery, and Patricia was almost always there too, exhausted, frightened in a way I'd never seen from her before, all the performance and control of the kitchen stripped away in the fluorescent quiet of a cardiac unit waiting room. I sat with her more than once during those evenings, not talking about the kitchen, not talking about anything charged at all, just sitting together in plastic chairs while machines beeped somewhere down the hall. I remember thinking, during one of those long silent evenings, that this was maybe the most equal I'd ever felt with her, two women worried about the same man, neither one of us performing anything for the other. I held on to that feeling for a while after Walter recovered, hoping it might carry over into the kitchen once things went back to normal. It didn't. Within 2 months of Walter coming home, I was back at the corner table for Sunday dinner, chopping celery that never made it into anything. I want to tell you about the actual collapse, because it happened faster than any of us expected, and it happened for reasons that had nothing to do with the family drama at all, which somehow made it feel more disorienting rather than less. Walter's real estate firm had been quietly overextended for years, it turned out, a series of commercial properties acquired during an aggressive expansion phase a decade earlier that never quite recovered their value after a regional downturn. None of us knew the extent of it. Walter, it seems, hadn't fully told even Patricia the specifics, some old-fashioned instinct to protect her from financial worry that, in the end, only made the eventual reckoning more brutal. The firm collapsed over about 18 months, slowly at first and then all at once, the way these things often do, and by the time it was fully unwound, Walter and Patricia's personal assets, heavily leveraged against the business in ways nobody outside the immediate finances had understood, were dramatically insufficient to cover what remained owed. The house, the colonial, the 8-burner kitchen, the marble counter selected from 12 samples, went up for a forced, distressed sale 11 months after Walter's second cardiac event, at a fraction of what the family had always assumed it was worth. I want to tell you about how the extended family found out, because it happened in stages, the way bad financial news often does, rumor arriving well before confirmation. Beth called me first, actually, before Ryan had even heard directly from his father, having picked up fragments from a mutual family friend whose husband worked in the same regional business circles as Walter. She asked me, carefully, whether I'd heard anything, and I told her honestly that I hadn't, and we sat on the phone together for a while, both of us turning over the same uneasy speculation, neither of us wanting to be the one who said out loud what we were both starting to suspect. I remember hanging up that call and standing in my own kitchen, the one Ryan has always been welcome to cook in, feeling a strange, complicated dread, not satisfaction, despite 11 years of that corner table, just a genuine, unglamorous worry for two people I'd grown to care about even through everything. I want to tell you about the day Ryan found out, because it's a day I won't forget. His father called him directly, his voice, Ryan told me later, sounding smaller than he'd ever heard it, to explain that the house needed to be sold, quickly, to satisfy creditors, and that he and Patricia would be moving into a rental condo across town. Ryan sat at our kitchen table, my kitchen table, the one in our own home, where I have never once told him he wasn't welcome to cook, and he put his head in his hands, and I watched 30-some years of his mother's identity, the hosting, the 8 burners, the reputation that made it into a neighborhood newsletter once, collapse into a real estate listing that was going to be sold, most likely, to a stranger. I sat down across from him at that table and asked what he was thinking, and he was quiet for a long time before he said something that surprised me, given everything we'd both lived through in that house over 11 years. He said, "I keep thinking about my mother standing in some rental condo kitchen with a stove she didn't choose, cooked on by whoever lived there before her. I know how that's going to feel to her, and I hate that I know exactly how it's going to feel, because it's the same thing she did to you for 11 years, and some part of me almost feels like she deserves to understand it now, and I hate that I feel that way about my own mother." I didn't have a tidy response for him in that moment. I just reached across the table and held his hand, and we sat there for a long time, neither of us saying much else, both of us absorbing the strange, uncomfortable justice of what was happening without either of us having caused it. I'm going to stop the story here, right at that kitchen table, right at Ryan with his head in his hands and his father's voice still ringing in his ears, because what happened over the following 6 weeks, the private LLC, the closing table nobody in the family knew about, and what I did the first time I stood alone at that 8-burner range with the keys to the house finally in my own hand, that entire story is coming in the next video. But I will tell you this much before we go tonight. I did not buy that house for revenge. I bought it for a reason that surprised even me, and I think it's going to surprise you too. I want to give you just a small piece of how that decision actually started, though, before I close out tonight, because I think it matters. It wasn't my idea first. It was Ryan's. About 4 days after his father's call, sitting at that same kitchen table, he said, almost tentatively, like he was testing whether the idea was crazy before saying it fully out loud, "What if we bought it?" Not to be cruel about it. Just, I can't stand the idea of strangers gutting that kitchen for some flip, and I can't stand the idea of my mother watching it happen to someone else either way. What if we just made sure it stayed in the family, quietly, without her having to know right away who actually did it? I sat with that idea for days before I said yes, turning over every version of how it could go wrong, how Patricia might react, whether this was generosity or something more complicated, wearing generosity's clothes. I still don't think I've fully answered that question, even now. But I said yes, and 6 weeks later, we were standing at a closing table neither of us had told a single family member about, signing papers that would make us, quietly, the actual owners of the one kitchen in the world I'd spent 11 years being told wasn't mine to touch. If this story hit close to home for you tonight, if you've ever been made to feel like a permanent guest in a space that should have had room for you, tell me in the comments, and tell me honestly, would you have stayed at that corner table for 11 years, or would you have said something sooner than I ever managed to? I want to leave you with one more thought before I go tonight, because I've turned it over a lot in the weeks since we closed on that house. There's a version of this story where I walk into that kitchen for the first time as its actual owner and feel nothing but triumph, 11 years of exclusion finally, cleanly avenged. That's not quite what happened, and I don't think it would be honest of me to pretend otherwise. What I actually felt, standing at that range with all 8 burners lit, was something closer to grief tangled up with relief, grief for the 11 Thanksgivings I can't get back, for the niece who noticed the pattern before most of the adults would say it out loud, for a father-in-law who ate secret hospital meals and never told his wife who'd made them. The triumph was in there too, I won't pretend it wasn't. But it wasn't the biggest thing in the room that day, and I think that surprised me more than almost anything else about how this whole story ended up unfolding. And if you want to know exactly how the sale happened, what Patricia said when she found out who really owned the house, and what I finally served at the first dinner I hosted in that kitchen. Make sure you hit subscribe right now, because that part of the story is coming next, and I promise you, it is worth the wait.